we are extremely pleased to be here today in person and virtually for many of us to be able to discuss in this briefing the new IPCC Climate Change 2022 report, Mitigation of Climate Change. I'm extremely pleased to welcome our speakers who have been amazing and worked so hard to write, research, review, and bring this report to life. I would like also to make sure we thank the organizers. So thank you to the Geneva Environment Network for organizing this event in collaboration with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. And to make sure also that we thank also Switzerland for the support for making these events happen by the support given to the Geneva Environment Network overall action. What I had said and you haven't heard me, and maybe I shouldn't repeat it, but I find that by reading the report, we have reasons to be pessimistic and optimistic. And we want today to hear from our speakers concretely, how can we be optimistic and deal with the pessimistic side and understand from this report what has been the progress in terms of climate action. What I found extremely also interesting for this report, it's the true connection between bringing the understanding of mitigation and the threats of contemporary issues around climate change connected to the reality of our lives. So looking into transport and cities and buildings in industry and land use, it's really amazing to have this connection and to bring this very scientific understanding to bring us to more and to the general audiences. And that's one of the purpose of the meeting today. We will hear really from the specialists who were involved in the report and also perspectives from the business side and from the civil society side. I will introduce the speakers as we go along in the panel. So I will already start by introducing our first speaker who is here in person. We are in sharing the table. So Sebastian Koenig, I'm extremely happy to introduce you today as the IPCC focal point for Switzerland. And you are the chief scientist in the International Affairs Division of the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment. And you have this long-term vision on the engagement on environmental issues, having been also UNEP's focal point for Switzerland. I saw in your biography that you have also what every speaker in this panel brings, the scientific, the policy vision, and very practical vision as well from different projects that you have led in different developing and emerging countries around different continents. So I think that we are very happy to have you here, and I pass on the floor to you for the opening remarks of this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tina. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Excellencies, colleagues, a marathon is a long-distance foot race with a distance of 42.195 kilometers, usually run as a road race, but the distance can be covered on trail routes. A marathon can be completed by running or with a run-walk strategy. By looking back to the approval session of the Working Group 3, one could argue that the meeting was a perfect analogy for a marathon race. On Sunday night, we finally crossed the finish line. It was not just the issue of covering a long distance, more so while we were diving into the intricacies of the language here and there, we also took the trail routes. And for a large part of the meeting, delegations choose a walk strategy over running. Our distinguished panel will soon be providing us with the most important takeaways from the report. Here, I wanted to bring to your attention a few points that may not be highlighted when considering the outcomes of the new IPCC report, points that still remain critically important. Switzerland is glad to host such a diverse set of actors in international Geneva. I'm convinced that the knowledge is here, where the world's competence centers for environment, health, trade, development, or labor are located. The IPCC report shows that many mitigation options are available across sectors: energy, land use change, transport, or buildings. When considering these sectors, the role of trade becomes evident in the report as it states. Trade rules have the potential to stimulate international adoption of mitigation technologies and policies. There is no doubt that the WTO and the cluster of actors have a critical and overarching role to play. As for health, the summary declares urgency. Quote, "Without urgent, effective, and equitable mitigation actions, climate change increasingly threatens the health and livelihoods of people around the globe, ecosystem health and biodiversity." End of quote. Not only WHO and the health of people is being brought to the attention of the reader, the health of biodiversity is equally important. A topic that is at the core of business for many actors in this room and in the greater Geneva area as such. My third and final example considers the chemical and waste cluster, including the way we make use of natural resources. With high confidence, the report states that plastic is a material for which demand has been growing the strongest since 1970. Reducing emissions from the production and use of chemicals would need to rely on a life cycle approach, including increased plastic recycling. Over decades, Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention have been working on setting the basis for sound management of chemicals and waste. More recently, also setting a reference with the amendment related to plastic waste. With the new mandate now by the UN Environment Assembly, member states have been given the task to establish a new UN Plastics Treaty. The IPCC has challenged us with this report to work towards a full life cycle approach and towards a circular economy for plastics and beyond. Mitigation of climate change is deeply rooted in many areas of action, as I've tried to illustrate with a few examples. Geneva is the place where numerous intergovernmental organizations, permanent government missions, NGOs, platforms, academic institutions, and other stakeholders contribute to the global environmental agenda. Geneva is therefore an ideal location to reinforce and develop synergies among all these actors towards climate change action. The new report provides an overview of the tools we are to significantly reduce the emissions, in particular for the next decade to come. As I was referring to the marathon with the approval session of the SPM, we're now looking forward to climate action and implementation. We are rather looking at multiples, Iron Women and Iron Men races, where we have to use different ways, be it on foot, by bike, or while swimming, to get over the finish line. But instead of doing that each by our own, we must do it collectively. Colleagues, Switzerland looks forward to hosting the IPCC family in Geneva, hopefully in a personal setting at the end of September, when the synthesis report is being approved. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sebastian Koenig, for these introductory remarks that plunge us already in the report. You used the keywords urgency, the keyword people, and talking of health, so bringing us to the realities of our daily life, but also making us understand that mitigation touches upon so many different areas, and also the importance of the Geneva platform, home to the IPCC in particular, as a key place where these areas are discussed pushed for and researched. So now I propose that we continue with our panel, and we have two guests who will really bring us into the report. We have the honor to have the IPCC Working Group 3 co-chair, Mr. Jim Ski, and we have the IPCC Working Group 3 vice chair, Ms. Diana Forsatz. So what we will do, we'll start with Mr. Ski, who will do the first part of the presentation, and we have a pre-recorded video message from Ms. Urj Varsatz, and who will then be available for the questions later on in the panel. Mr. Jimski, I just give you a very brief introduction of your very long professional investment, engagement, and career around very much the question of energy and climate change and technological innovation. You are the current Working Group 3 co-chair, but also a professor of sustainable energy at the Imperial College in London. And you are also the chair of the Scotland's Just Transition Commission and founding member of the UK's Committee on Climate Change, acting there as the Scottish champion. And of course, I find in the biographies of all our guests today, there is always this connection between the vision, the science, the understanding, and practical experiences brought into this. And I find it's amazing everything that you have worked on different capacities around energy strategies and sustainable transportation, sustainable energy. So I give you the floor now, and then we'll have the video from Ms. Urj Forsatz. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Dina. And could I just start by also acknowledging Switzerland and Sebastian's own efforts to urge us and the delegates to run rather than walk through the approval session. That was much appreciated, though we still ran over time a lot. Also, before I start, I'd like to just acknowledge the enormous amount of efforts put in by the authors who produced this report. There were countless hours that they put in, and it was under very difficult circumstances, often due to the pandemic. And I would say also like to acknowledge my my co-chair, Priyadarshi Shukla, PR Shukla, who was unable to join us. Can you still hear me? I've lost the screen.
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. I'll keep going as it is. So Shukla and I worked together side by side for 5 years to guide the work on the report. But Diana will be joining me, and we will now work through things. So just in terms of the kind of the statistics, the assessment was prepared by 278 authors from 65 countries. We reviewed more than 18,000 scientific papers and considered close to 60,000 individual comments from governments and experts as part of the drafting process. And all of this feedback really helped to strengthen the report. So I'm struggling to move my screen on. Okay, so we're going to set out the key findings, showing where we are in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and where we're headed, and what action we can take to limit global warming. The reality is that greenhouse gas emissions, which are causing global warming, are at their highest level in history. Emissions in 2019 were about 12% higher than they were in 2010, and 54% higher than they were in 1990. So unambiguously, we're not on track to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. However, there are messages of hope in the report. There's increased evidence of climate action, and the average annual rate of growth in global emissions slowed in the last decade from 2.1% per year in the early part of this century to 1.3% per year between 2010 and 2019. This decline is particularly noticeable in the energy and industry sectors, where the rate of growth has more than halved. But despite this progress, our assessment concludes that unless there's immediate and deep emission reductions across all sectors, 1.5 degrees will be beyond reach. Now, the other good sign is some countries have achieved a steady decrease in emissions over several years at rates consistent with limiting warming to 2 degrees, and a growing number of cities are actually setting net zero targets. An increasing range of policies and laws have enhanced energy efficiency, reduced rates of deforestation, and accelerated the deployment of renewable energy. And climate laws that result in reduced or avoided emissions are present in 56 countries, covering more than half of global emissions. Now, one particular success is around renewable energy. Since 2010, there have been sustained decreases in the unit costs, with reductions of 85% for solar energy, 55% for wind power, and 85% for batteries. And in some cases, these costs have fallen below those of fossil fuels. At the same time, we've seen large increases in installed capacity, as this figure shows. Now, looking at policies that were implemented by December 2020, we conclude that without strengthening mitigation efforts, greenhouse gas emissions are projected to lead to warming of 3.2 degrees. In the scenarios we assessed, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees requires global greenhouse gas emissions to peak before 25 at the latest and be reduced by 43% by 2030. Emissions from methane, a short-lived but potent greenhouse gas, would also need to be reduced by about a third over the same period. And even if we do this, it's almost inevitable that we will temporarily exceed 1.5 degrees, but we could return below this level by the end of the century. Now, limiting warming to 2 degrees still requires global emissions to peak before 2025 at the latest and be reduced by a quarter by 2030. Global temperatures will stabilize when we reach net zero carbon dioxide emissions. And to limit warming to around 1.5 degrees requires reaching net zero carbon dioxide emissions in the early 2050s. And for 2 degrees, carbon dioxide emissions would have to be reduced to net zero in the early 2070s. And deep and sustained reductions of other gases would also be required. Now, at this point, I'm actually going to pass over to my colleague, Diana Urga-Vorsats, who's going to take us through the options that would allow us to reach, that are available in each sector to combat climate change. And once Diana's finished, I'll just come back with a few final remarks as well. And I will stop sharing to enable Diana to come on.
So before just sending the message on, I just want to give one brief outlook on Diana's background as well. As the vice chair of the IPCC Working Group 3, but Diana is also a professor at the Department of Environmental Sciences and Policies at the Central European University, CEU. Also extremely important, I think, for us, it's to also remind that Ms. Urga-Vorsats has been coordinating and lead author in 2 assessment reports of the IPCC. So what a long experience of bringing this together. And she has served at the United Nations Scientific Expert Group on Climate Change and led so many different pieces of work around global energy and the global energy assessment. We have the pre-recorded message from Ms. Urga-Vorsats. So please, please go ahead and with the video. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim. I'm Diana Urga-Vorsats, one of the vice chairs of Working Group 3. What I would like to do now is to walk you through the available options that can be mobilized in each sector to combat climate change. In every sector, there are options available now that can at least halve emissions by 2030 and keep open the possibility of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Let's walk through these. The energy sector accounts for about a third of all emissions, and major transitions are required to limit global warming. This will involve substantial reduction in fossil fuel use, low or no carbon energy systems, widespread electrification, use of alternative fuels such as hydrogen and sustainable biofuels, use of carbon capture and storage, and improved energy efficiency. Transitioning to a low carbon energy sector is expected to cut down international trade in fossil fuels. Energy efficiency and reductions in energy consumption can be achieved using digital technologies. In this way, it is also possible to decentralize the energy network so that power comes from multiple localized energy networks rather than one main electricity grid. Electricity systems powered by renewables are becoming increasingly viable, but it will be challenging to supply the entire system in this way. Changes to our lifestyles and behavior can reduce our carbon footprint, as well as improve our health and well-being. There is untapped potential here to bring down global emissions by between 40 to 70% by 2050, but only if the necessary policies, infrastructure, and technologies are in place. Of the 60 actions assessed in this report on an individual level, the biggest contribution comes from switching to walking and cycling and using electrified transport. Other effective options include reducing air travel and adopting our houses. Shifting towards plant-based diets is also an option. Wealthier individuals have the highest potential for reductions as investors, consumers, role models, or professionals. While there is mitigation potential in many regions of the world, in some places, people require additional housing, energy, and resources for human well-being. To be effective, lifestyle changes will need to be supported by systemic changes across every aspect of society, including transport, buildings, industry, and land use. Looking at the transport sector, reducing demand plays an important part in reducing emissions, and low carbon technologies are also key. Electric vehicles offer the greatest potential, as long as they are combined with low or zero carbon electricity sources. Advances in battery technologies could assist in the electrification of trucks and complement conventional electric rail systems. In aviation and shipping, which are harder to decarbonize, alternative fuels such as low emissions hydrogen and biofuels will be needed. Overall, there is substantial potential for emissions reductions in the transport sector, but this depends on decarbonizing the energy supply sector. Cities and other urban areas account for more than 2/3 of global emissions, if we take into account what is produced in the city and brought in from elsewhere through energy and products. And there is significant potential for emissions reductions. In all cities, better urban planning is key. 3 other broad strategies have been found to be effective. These include the sustainable consumption and production of goods and services, electrification, improving carbon uptake and storage in cities, for example, with trees, permeable surfaces, green roofs, and lakes. In buildings, it is possible to reach net zero emissions in 2050. Action in this decade is critical to fully capture this potential. This will involve retrofitting existing buildings and using effective mitigation techniques in those that are yet to be built. This requires ambitious policy packages, which may incorporate efficient design and use of space, energy, materials, appliances, as well as the use of renewables. There is an increasing number of zero energy or zero carbon buildings in almost all climates and building types. This has come about from construction and retrofitting. But more can be done to reduce emissions in this sector if renovation rates and retrofitting are improved. Reducing emissions in industry will involve reusing materials and energy more efficiently, reusing and recycling products, and minimizing waste. These approaches are underused in policies and industrial practice at present. For basic materials, including steel, building materials, and chemicals, low to zero greenhouse gas emission production processes are at their pilot to near commercial stage. In some cases, they are at commercial stage, but not yet established in the industrial practice. This sector amounts for about a quarter of global emissions. Achieving net zero will be challenging and will require new production processes, low and zero emission electricity, hydrogen, and, where necessary, carbon capture and storage. To counterbalance hard to eliminate emissions, for example, in agriculture, aviation, and some industrial processes, as mentioned already, requires carbon dioxide removal. These methods remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it on land, underground, or in the ocean. There are biological methods that can store carbon, such as reforestation and soil carbon management. These are widely practiced. New technologies, such as direct air capture and storage, require more research, upfront investment, and proof of concept at larger scales before they can be widely used. Carbon dioxide removal is essential to reach net zero. For carbon dioxide removal to work effectively, agreed methods for measuring, reporting, and very quick verification are required. And finally, agriculture, forestry, and other land use can provide large-scale emissions reductions and remove and store carbon dioxide at scale. This can be done by protecting and restoring natural ecosystems, including forests, peatlands, coastal wetlands, savannas, and grasslands. Improved and sustainable crop and livestock management can also play a part. Land provides us with so much, for example, food, nature, and our livelihoods. These competing demands have to be carefully managed. But land can only do so much in terms of removing and storing carbon and cannot compensate for delayed emission reductions in other sectors. To look at how we strengthen the response and accelerate low carbon transition, I would like to hand back to Jim.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Diana. We do know that the next few years are very critical if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And what I'd like to share with you now for a couple of minutes are the ways that we can improve our chances of success. So I'm going to start with finance. Our assessment shows that financial flows are a factor of 3 to 6 times lower than levels needed by 2030 to limit warming to below 1.5 or 2 degrees. But there is sufficient global capital and liquidity to close investment gaps. Clear signalling from governments and the international community, including a stronger alignment of public sector finance and policy, is critically important. And the challenge of closing gaps is actually widest for developing countries. Now, without taking into account the economic benefits of reduced adaptation costs or avoided climate impacts, global gross domestic product would be just a few percentage points lower in 2050 if we take the necessary actions to limit warming to 2 degrees or below, compared to maintaining existing policies. Now, turning our attention now to regulatory and economic instruments and policies, which play a crucial role in strengthening the response. Regulatory and economic instruments ranging from standards for vehicles and building codes, policies for industrial decarbonisation, and broad-based carbon taxes and emission trading systems have already proven effective in reducing emissions, and such measures can be strengthened and expanded significantly. Policy packages and economy-wide packages are better able to achieve systemic change than individual policy instruments working on their own. So ambitious and effective mitigation requires coordination across government, setting and implementing strategies and building consensus among disparate stakeholders. These efforts are particularly effective when they build on engagement with civil society, indigenous peoples, professional bodies, and business. In recent years, there's been enormous activity and significant progress in technology and innovation, which is very much reflected in the report. Investment in policies, especially for scientific training, as well as research and development, push forwards low emissions technological innovation. And key to effective decision-making is assessing the potential benefits and risks of different technologies and approaches, understanding their implementation at scale, and identifying what stands in their way. Some options are technically viable, increasingly cost-effective and generally supported by the public, and this is enabling deployment in many regions. And examples there include solar energy, energy-efficient appliances, improved forest and crop management, and reduced food waste. Other options face barriers that need to be addressed before they can be implemented at scale. The adoption of low-emission technologies is slower in most developing countries, particularly least developed ones, due to limited capacities. In all countries, actions to limit global warming that result in wider benefits to society can increase the pace, depth, and breadth of emissions reductions. Accelerated and equitable climate action in mitigating and adapting to climate change impacts is critical to sustainable development. In this report, we actually show how mitigation goes hand in hand with achieving many of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we see that equity and just transitions can lead to deeper ambition for accelerated climate action, and many countries and regions are already applying just transition principles. In our assessment, we also look at how mitigation actions can also lead to sustainable development. And just two quick examples. Starting with something in the urban area, as we focus on just one option, green and blue infrastructure, we see that green roofs and facades, networks of parks and open spaces, wetlands and urban agriculture not only absorb and store carbon, but at the same time achieve many other sustainable development goals, as you can see with the squares in this graph. For example, they can reduce pressure on urban sewer systems, reduce flood risk and heat island effects, and they can also deliver health benefits from reduced air pollution. Focusing on land use, avoiding deforestation and sustainably managing soils, forests and livestock can also mitigate climate change. And these actions align well with sustainable development and can also result in responsible production, improved livelihoods and food security. Potential conflicts between reducing emissions and sustainable development, particularly around land use and the need to ensure access to food, water and energy, can be managed with the right policies, investments and financial partnerships. So this gives an insight into the wider benefits of mitigation, and our report provides a very comprehensive assessment of these. So just to finish it off, climate change is the result of more than a century of unsustainable energy and land use and patterns of consumption and production. This report shows how taking action now can move us towards a fairer and more livable world. So just to finish off, we know what to do, we know how to do it, and now it's up to us to actually take action.
Thank you so much. So dear Jim, dear Diana, thank you for such strong messages. I really think they're very strong, and they are there in our front, in front of our eyes. With this report, with your presentation, you managed to bring the results of the report to our understanding at individual and collective level. So it's very striking to hear you speak of lifestyle changes that I think speak to absolutely each of us individually, but also to hear you speaking about these systemic changes that are about policy ambition and about a collective higher level investment that is a call for policy action and for choices to be made, while always in everything that you mentioned, there is behind everything that you say this reality of the inequalities of the world we live in. So I think that you really manage, in my view, to call for action, and I thank you for giving the road for optimism that I was talking about at the introduction of this session. Now for the session, we have three more distinguished speakers. So I will go directly to introduce the next speaker. So I have the honor to welcome Ligia Noronha, who is the UN Assistant Secretary General and head of UNEP New York office. So once again, we have here a very impressive engagement, professional engagement on long term. Ligia, you have worked as an economist for over 30 years, connecting issues of green economy, sustainable communities, pollution, health, sustainable finance. You have worked as a director of UNEP Economy Division in Paris and Nairobi, and now your portfolio is very much in New York to really connect at UN level all these intergovernmental processes that raise the awareness on all emerging environmental issues, and also to bring this in to connect with the results of the UN Environment Assembly. So I pass the floor to you now. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Ina, for those very kind words and for your kind introduction. Excuse me. Good morning, Sebastian and Jim, Diana, and all distinguished participants today. Let me start by thanking the chairs, the vice chairs, and the panel members for all the really hard work, which today we are seeing as a contribution to the climate change work. We're indeed very grateful to you. As Jim said just now, and he's, the time for action is now. And he very, very well summed up. We know what to do, we know how to do it, and it's up to us to take action. I think that's a really important message. My task in this discussion today is to bring in another important report on mitigation issues, the emissions gap report, that keeps reminding us every year ahead of the climate COP that we are not doing enough of what we need to do. So in a way, complementing exactly what Jim has just said. I will pull out some of the converging messages from both these reports. However, to understand the significance of these messages in scope and time, it is important to recognize the similarities, differences, objectives, and complementarity of the emissions gap report with the IPCC report. Both of them are anchored in UNEP, with the latter co-hosted by UNEP and WMO. The emissions gap report, as you know, is an annual independent science-based assessment since 2010, and the IPCC cycle is typically 6 years, and its scope is much broader. As we just heard brilliantly portrayed by Jim and Diana, the IPCC mitigation report does not only assess progress made in limiting global emissions and available mitigation options, but it places mitigation in the context of sustainable development and the 2030 agenda, which is really very important to do, and also reviews the connection between short, medium, and long-term emission pathways. It assesses social aspects of mitigation, innovation, and technology, cross-sector mitigation opportunities, links and trade-offs between mitigation and adaptation, and contribution to human well-being more generally. I'm especially excited that this report this year is focusing on sustainable consumption and production and circularity or recycling, renewing and recovering all the various aspects of circularity, and materials efficiency, because I strongly believe that the climate change discussion has not engaged sufficiently with all of these aspects. And I'm really, really happy that now it's come to the surface. The emissions gap report, which is published annually ahead of the UNFCCC COPs, informs climate change negotiations about the gaps between levels of global emissions, assuming that countries fully implement their climate commitments for 2030, and the levels that IPCC science tells us are consistent with a likely chance of achieving the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement to limit global warming at the end of the century to well below 2 degrees while pursuing 1.5. In short, while the IPCC tells us every 6 years what we need to do to get where we want to be in terms of emission levels, the emissions gap report every year alerts us to the divergence between what should be in 2030 to meet the Paris Agreement and where pledges bring these emission levels. This serves as a kind of a temperature gauge for the negotiations at the COPs to highlight the urgency of responses and actions. The emissions gap reports also investigate opportunities for bridging the emissions gap and covered a range of pertinent sectors similar to the ones that you just heard from the IPCC report. As the emissions gap report specifically targets UNFCCC process and discussions, it is tailored to bring in new international issues every year. To illustrate, the 2021 edition focused on updating and assessing new NDCs and net zero targets, and the second part focused on whether the COVID-19 fiscal rescue and recovery measures were used to accelerate a low carbon transition, and looked at the scope for reducing methane emissions and the role of market mechanisms, given the prominence of these issues in the COP26 context. This complements very well the recent report of the IPCC, which does not include the new NDCs submitted at the COP26 because they were submitted after its cutoff date of literature review of October 2021. Now let's look at the converging messages, and I will stick to the ones that Jim presented. Message 1, both reports speak to the need of urgent action and that we are not on track to limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. The IPCC points to the average annual emissions during 2010 to 19 being the highest in human history. The message of the Emissions Gap Report 2021 is similar. Updates to the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement follow the trajectory of weak promises not yet delivered. Both speak to the inequity in emissions. The IPCC report notes that globally, the rich 10% households contribute about 40%, the range is 34 to 45, of global consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions, while the bottom 50% contribute less than 15%, in the range of 13 to 15. The Lifestyles chapter of the Emissions Gap 2020 has the same message with slightly different numbers. It estimates that the top 10 contribute about 48% of consumption-based emissions, while the bottom 50% contribute around 7%. It furthermore finds that the top 1% of income earners account for more than twice the combined share of the poorest 50%. Compliance with 1.5 degrees goal of the Paris Agreement will require reducing emissions of consumption emissions to a per capita lifestyle footprint of around 2 to 2.5 times carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030. And this is also very interesting given the strong focus on lifestyle changes that we just heard from the presentations of Jim and Deanna. Both reports reflect on COVID-19, to the emissions of CO2 from fossil fuels and industry, which dropped temporarily in the first half of 2020 due to responses to the pandemic, but rebounded by the end of the year. The Emissions Gap Report speaks to a missed opportunity for using COVID-19 fiscal rescue and recovery spending to stimulating the economy while fostering a low carbon transformation in most countries so far. Message 2 of the Working Group 3 speaks of the evidence of climate action, and we just heard again this being referred to. The cost of alternatives have fallen, enhanced climate supportive policies are evident. in many countries. But both reports say that without strengthening these policies that have been implemented by the end of 2020, the greenhouse gas emissions are projected to rise beyond 25, leading to average global warming of 3.2 degrees. The message 3, both see low-hanging fruit in mitigation options available now in all sectors. And you heard Diana refer to the ability of halving emissions by 2030 in energy, buildings, transport, industry, agriculture and land use. She spoke of digital technologies, decentralized energy systems to take this forward. The emissions gap report of 2017 provided an updated assessment of sectoral emission reduction potentials by 2030. It has also consistently found that 2030 reduction potentials are sufficient to bridge the 2030 gap, provided they exploit it fully and importantly, immediately. Message 4, both reports see the next few years to be critical and collective action to be very, very important to success. IPCC speaks to actions that have multiple benefits to the society as accelerating emission reductions because it has traction amongst a far larger group of people and therefore more easy to absorb. It speaks to scaling finance. It speaks to whole of government and multi-stakeholder approaches to enhanced coordination. It speaks to the use of policy instruments for system-wide changes rather than discrete policy instruments that do not have the same impact. It speaks to low emission technology cooperation. And this is very important. We also heard Sebastian link this agenda, the climate agenda, to various other agendas, because if it does so, it has a huge, stronger impact on the kind of benefits and the kind of policies that can be brought to bear. The emission gap reports have all been aligned to this and have included a number of focus chapters over the years that have touched on these aspects, including the 2018 report, which includes chapters on the opportunities for strengthening nationally determined contribution and domestic policies, fiscal reforms for a low carbon transition, and the role of innovation and markets. The 2019 report followed suit with chapters on enhancing mitigation, ambition, and action at the G20 level, and globally transformations towards zero carbon development pathways, with a strong focus on core benefits and achievement of the SDGs. Again, strong complementarities between the two reports. Message 5, both agree that there are immediate and deep greenhouse gas emission reductions across all sectors, and without which 1.5 is beyond reach. I will not go into this again because this has been amply discussed and presented by my previous speakers. Message 6, accelerated climate action is key to ensure the 2030 agenda. The transition to sustainability requires solutions to fundamental distribution issues. This is a key message coming from these reports, and they need to be thought of very, very carefully to ensure that we have a just and fair transition. To close, both reports speak to, 1, the need of urgency of mitigation actions as time is running out to meet the Paris goals. Both speak to the distribution aspect of the emissions. Secondly, the possibility of significant reductions by 2030 as prices of renewables have fallen drastically and technologies are available, but we need to act now. Thirdly, the key economic sectors which present low-hanging options, the need for scaling finance, and the importance of time being critical, but also system-wide changes, given the multiple goals that climate agenda speaks to. Thank you very much. And over to you, Dina.
Thank you so much, dear Lija, for showing us the coherence between the reports and calling our attention on this very important emission gap report. And in 6 key messages, I will do a check if everyone can repeat the 6 messages at the end. I'm sure that we can do it. It was very clear. So I want now to go to our next speaker. And I have the honor and the pleasure to introduce you to Maria Mendiluce. So, Maria, you are the Chief Executive Officer of We Mean Business. I love the title, We Mean Business. That we know what you mean immediately with the title. You are the Chief Executive Officer since 2020 now, and you came to the coalition from your former role as Managing Director for Circular Economy, Cities, Mobility and Climate and Energy at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So it cuts across absolutely all the presentation from Jim and Diana we had before. And you took over this when Nigel Topping moved to his new role as high-level climate action champion. So that's also says about maybe your future. And Maria, I think your engagement over the past years again highlights the connection between sustainable development, energy, climate action, urban mobility. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today and to talk about what this means for business. My presentation is going to have no slides and 5 messages, and let's see if you can remember them at the end. But I'm going to tell them twice, maybe 3 times. The first one is we don't have time to lose. The second one is business are committed. The third one is that we need to move from the thousands of business committed to the millions. The fourth one is business need to do 4 things, and they are called the 4 A's, which I will explain later. And the fifth message is that we absolutely need to accelerate the transition, as this IPCC report is telling us, and as the war in Ukraine is also showing us. So let me start with the first message. Our planet is in intensive care even today. There's no time to lose. It's going to be very, very hard to meet the 1.5. So we need all the solutions, all the incentives. We need to move fast. We need carbon pricing. We need to phase out some energies and some materials. We need to create regulation, a lot of regulations, so that we have the materials that are less energy intensive and carbon intensive. It also shows that we need to adapt because climate change is happening already, and it's going to affect many people, many vulnerable people, 15 times more. The vulnerable people that probably all of us in this call, or the people like us in this call. So we need to understand the risk of climate change in our lives. We're seeing it now. It's not climate change, a war in Ukraine, how that's affecting global supply chains, carbon pricing, energy prices, inflation, and this is going to also happen with climate change. Let's move to the second message. Business are committed. At Women Business, and it was Nigel, we created the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And this was created in Paris because we wanted to show the way for companies to be aligned with Paris on a voluntary basis. There are 2,700 companies, large companies that have committed to set science-based targets aligned with Paris. They come from all sectors, textile, retail, food, energy, you name it. In total, and then very recently, the coalition Women Business created the SME Climate Hub, which is an initiative to also invite SMEs to be aligned with Paris. There we have 4,000 companies that have committed to it. So in total, with this, and we are close to 7,000 companies that are committed to the Paris Agreement, but there are millions of companies. There are 45 million companies. So how are we going to move from the thousands to the millions? So I think, let's face it, we need to start disclosing. So the work that ISSB, SEC in the US, the European Union with the different directives are doing is definitely the way forward. We need that companies start to measure and report their emissions, because what gets measured gets managed, and what gets managed provides benefits for the P&L. Let me give you an example, okay, so that then I turn this into real. Which connects also with carbon pricing. So the cement companies, for many years, they have said, no, it's impossible to meet the Paris Agreement, impossible. And then the European Union introduced them in the emission trading system. And so suddenly they realized, you know, by having the cost of carbon, starting to measure emissions, that actually they could reduce emissions, and that was good for their business. To the point that now the largest cement companies have committed to net zero and are advocating for the introduction of the sector on carbon pricing scheme around the world, because it's good for business, because it discovers how to be more efficient. The second area to move to the millions is investors. So we are seeing with the G funds launched at Glasgow and other, many investors and the bank industry are coming late to the game, but well, they are here. And they need to align their portfolios, and they lend to many, many businesses. And so that's going to provide another push for companies and corporates to be aligned with 1.5. And then, of course, we need corporate leadership. And as you know, when you commit to net zero, you also need to reduce your supply chain emissions. And we need to help those providers that are in the order of the thousands to be aligned with Paris. We need to work with trade groups so that they are also aligned with Paris. And finally, to all on the call, we need to encourage SMEs to commit to net zero. And through the SME Climate Hub, which is a one-stop shop for SMEs to commit to net zero, they can have access to a calculator that allows them to measure their emissions, education tools that allows them to discover where to reduce emissions, and different activities that will help them in their journey to net zero. Because let's be honest, if we don't bring SMEs to net zero, we are not going to get there. We're going to have gilets jaunes in all over the place, all over the world. SMEs are a very important part of our economic tissue. They provide employment to the millions, and net zero is good for them, but they don't know it, and they don't have the resources, and they don't have the means to do that. So let's go to point number 4. I haven't spoken about women business, but it is a coalition that was formed in 2014 to bring the progressive voice of business to the climate negotiations and to the action on climate. So we have just approved, we have been working with this framework, but now it has been endorsed by the board. We work with 7 core partners, big business organization. We have 50 implementation partners, which is called the 4A framework. And so we're telling these 7,000 businesses, this is what you need to do. First A is you need to be ambitious and commit to set ambitious climate science-based targets. So they need to be validated, they need to be serious based on science. So those, the 7,000 companies are those, okay? They have those, either through SME Climate Hub or SBTi. The second one is action. There's lots of activities that the company can do in their own operations, but also you need to work with the supply chain. There are many initiatives that we support and accelerate through our funding, like RE100, companies committed to 100% renewables. The Mission Possible Partnership, developing roadmaps for the hard-to-abate sectors. There are lots of things happening in the action. In the action is where we ought to be. Advocacy. So we need to be aligned in the message we give to policymakers around what we need as business to accelerate our transition to net zero. And the first step was the G20 letter, which we produced last year, which had around 800 companies committing to it. And you know what was one of the first? Of course, the first task is to keep 1.5 alive. And the second one, we need to phase out coal in developed countries and in developing countries. So we need to start to put those dates, 2030 developed, 2040 developing countries, so that then, you know, no one can say we didn't tell you, so that if anyone invests now in coal, and I'm saying this because in the current circumstances, there will be some that will be investing in fossil fuel, additional fossil fuels, even if the IEA says that there's no place for them, the IPCC report as well, etc. So those companies are going to have stranded assets, okay? So no compensation, please. I mean, if you invest now in those fossil fuels, you will have stranded assets because there's no role for fossil fuels in our future. So anyway, and then the last one is accountability. And there is where the regulation that is happening is really important because we need to show progress. And that's the only way to advance. Okay, so let me come to the last, the 5th point. How can we accelerate the transition? So as we saw with COVID and now with the war in Ukraine, the transition to renewable energy makes a lot of sense because it brings more jobs, it brings more energy security. It is available all over the world. It is commercial, attractive. Everybody understands this. But it's not scaling up. There is a lot of red tape that we need to remove for this. Because it's not very complicated to put in place a solar farm or a wind park, etc. It's not. It is a lot of admin that is there that needs to be removed. But let me say that the first one is carbon pricing. We need a signal. We need a signal to the market. The second one is we need to look at the design of products and services from a circular economy perspective, because we need to reduce the use of materials because those materials have energy embedded in it, and so they have carbon, as we have heard before, right? The third one is that, well, as part of this, we need to start to look at phase out. Let me give you an example. This weekend, I go to IKEA and we wanted to buy some batteries, and guess what? They don't sell any more batteries. They sell rechargeable batteries, okay? So IKEA decided as well a few years ago that they were not going to sell any incandescent light bulb. And now, so those are examples that can be also led by regulation. So, of course, we need hydrogen, which is going to be the solution to many of the energy intensive. So governments need to invest in it. And we need all sorts of carbon removals. And we need to incentivize companies to invest in nature, in addition to their decarbonization, in addition, and not as a replacement, at a minimum as a 10%, more or less, which is what the SBTi says that will be the residual emissions on average for most of the sectors. We also need to invest in direct air capture, etc. So all this is well covered in the IPCC. And then let me choose the last 2 points in the acceleration. So we can't move to renewable energy, electric vehicles without the supporting infrastructure. So let's not forget that the grid is going to require massive investments for these decentralized energy systems. And the last point is around energy transition. So in this energy transition, unfortunately, the most vulnerable, if we don't take care of them, and mostly I think it's probably governments, also business, of course, in terms of reskilling, etc. But there are some communities that cannot afford to buy efficient equipment or to put solar panel in their roofs, and the policymakers need to create the conditions so that there is equity and they have access to those solutions and we don't leave behind. So there is a lot to do, and just, if we think about the marathon example that was placed at the beginning, we know, that when you run a marathon, you have certain milestones, no? So you have the first 10 kilometers is when you do better because you have energy, yeah? So that's where we are. And we need to do much better than in the last one. So we need to have emissions by 2030. And for this reason, we launched last year a campaign at Women in Business, which was called All In for 2030, because we need to focus on the next 10 years, all our attention. And All In includes all sectors and all people. And so we need to bring the people along in this incredible acceleration in the first 10 kilometers of the marathon that are the most important. Thank you very much, Tina.
Thank you so much, Maria. Some extra keywords from your presentation. I think invest in nature really struck me. And I think it's so important to call attention on the role of the small and medium-sized enterprises in sustainable development and in climate action. And also you highlighted the importance of having businesses present in the climate negotiation. So as we are preparing for COP27, I think that's also something to be considered also process-wise and content-wise. And I add 1A to your list for you and your amazing work, because I'm very impressed by Maria's work and commitment to this battle, in fact, to this marathon. And for those who don't run marathon like me, I don't. I think it still speaks very much. I think life is a marathon, so the whole metaphor works very well, I think. So we arrived to our last speaker in the panel, and I have the pleasure and honor to present Ms. Lindsay Fielder-Cook, who represents in the panel civil society engagement. But Lindsay, you have been really invested as an IPCC observer also in the work, reviewing and working very hard on all the IPCC reports. You are representative for climate change with the Quaker UN office. And again, a very interesting and rich professional engagement over the past years. I see all your work, in fact, from working on conflict areas, on reconciliation, youth work in Northern Ireland, but also in the Israeli occupied West Bank. You have worked on refugee protection, and now we know you focus very much on climate change and the environmental degradation and the whole peace and justice nexus and connection. So we bring also very much now the human rights efforts and perspective into discussion, which are so key to everything that we have discussed today. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dina, and thank you all. I will be brief. I want people to have questions as well. But as civil society voice, we are speaking through a lens to better integrate human rights-based approaches in mitigation policy for more coherent, sustainable, and legitimate climate policy. And while we're here, to uphold environmental defenders worldwide who risk their lives daily to defend the environment, and to uphold all those people involved in climate action now, all of you who are watching, and all our youth. You asked, Dina, about optimism. I just want to say I'm optimistic because of the IPCC. It is a remarkable space. It protects the integrity of the science, and authors can say no. They have a red line if negotiators try to push something that would compromise the integrity of the science. And it's one of the reasons I so love all the time we give to the IPCC. In some ways, IPCC is like a lawyer for nature for me, because it tells us what is at stake. So to thank, as Jim said, all the authors involved, many of whom, most of them are voluntary. The Working Group 3, the mitigation, is the most grueling and political of the approval processes. And I just want to say, Jim, you have Shackleton Stanima for going through what you did, especially with the situation with the co-chairs. And Sebastian, thank you too for all your efforts, really appreciated. In terms of this being the most political, because we're mitigating root causes of climate change, which often are making a few people a lot of money, being fossil fuels or industrial agriculture, deforestation, or our unsustainable economic systems and consumption. So coming into this report for the Working Group 3, we have had some major advantages coming in. We have the Sustainable Development Goals compared to the last time we had a Working Group 3 or fifth assessment report. We have the Paris Agreement with the 1.5. We have the special reports from the IPCC on what it means to hold temperature limits to 1.5 and all that we can save in lives and livelihoods and in species from being extinct. And we have the land report telling us what we do urgently now will keep land from becoming a source. So now it is a sink, but if we don't act urgently, it can become a source to make things even worse. And I think what I loved about also with this Working Group 3 for the 6th assessment report is there's greater diversity of input. There's a real attempt for more social sciences and a focus on not only economic growth, but on consumption emissions. So the key messages, and of the observers speaking, I also want to recognize CAN International and the European Union, who also were very vocal during this time. It's a massive report, but one thing I would say to all of you, please, not only read the summary for policymakers, read the underlying text. You can quote the underlying text. That is also the critical background. And as we have that Jim said, we have to recognize here that emissions in 2019 were 54% higher than in 1990. And that the chance for a 1.5 limit without overshoot, an overshoot, as Jim said, is when it goes higher, but also we lose lives, we lose livelihoods, we lose species if it overshoots. So holding to 1.5 is critical, and the urgency to do that. The report says that we have to peak emissions between 2020 and the latest 2025 for model pathways that limit to global warming. The time is now. And the other messages that came through very strongly, and this was said by our other colleagues, but globally 10% of households with the highest per capita emissions contribute up to 45% of global consumption-based household emissions. And that the bottom 50% contribute between 13 and 15%. So with this report, with this urgency and everything counting, on the technical side of this report, the message, the optimistic message, Dina, is that renewable energies, it is up and running, and that the decrease in the cost of renewable energies, plus the implementation of solar and energy, wind, and even lithium-based batteries, not only have they decreased in cost, but they have expanded much more dramatically than was expected. But I raised that concern coming out of the COP26, because at the COP26, we called for a phase down of coal, but there was not a call to phase down oil and gas. And so in this report, those things that we would highlight as civil society, we must address root causes and transform root causes, being fossil fuels. So when we see calls for carbon capture storage, one of the discussions throughout the 2 weeks was to make sure that it is clear that carbon capture storage is not yet available to scale, nor at the technology that is needed. So we need to transform and reduce the use of fossil fuels, rather than the concern is certain technical fixes would simply allow us to continue use of fossil fuels because they're very lucrative. So we have the challenges of money and power. And the other optimistic side was renewable energies, again, the decentralization, the empowerment of people to own their own energy sources. And this is critical. This is critical also for buy-in. Jim talked also about finance and the recognition in this report that it is way below it must be. We know that, but we need the IPCC statistics to help pressure, and not only the role of finance, but public finance and grants, and how much we would save by not needing the adaptation, but we're saving suffering, lives, and ecosystem collapse. The other points in the report that I would like to highlight: the focus on sustainable agriculture, again, sustainable. The discussions about diet were difficult. It is almost politically impossible to talk about reducing meat and dairy, but it is possible to talk about plant-based, although it was in a footnote, but that we have sustainable diets. The mitigation potential of reducing or transforming our diets is remarkable, and it's empowering for people. Also to talk about the role of carbon dioxide removal, I think Diana did a very good job to say this is only about hard to eliminate emissions. We must not be sort of addressing symptoms with technical fixes that don't actually transform what is driving climate change. And so we appreciated how the report tried to highlight these things. But again, money and power would like to maintain a lot of the drivers that are coming. So we need to ask those questions, and we need to be honest with ourselves and our governments. Finally, the optimistic, Dina, the people. I mean, this report, the working group 2 was remarkable on bringing in rights-based approaches and climate justice and participation. And working group 3 was bringing this in. We hope that it's more integrated in the synthesis report. But the people are the optimistic side for me, because when we have human rights-based approaches, and by that I mean you integrate in your climate policy human rights, Indigenous people's rights, gender, public participation, just transition, youth, protecting biodiversity, and food security. The working group 3 really worked on just transition, and we are thankful for what they did. But just transition is primarily about jobs and industry, and the rights-based approach is being more overall. If you want people to support you, if you want them to feel their voices are heard, if you want us to be part and to benefit from climate action so there isn't pushback, we need to ground them in people and in respecting and meaningful participation. So finally, in this report, we really appreciated the efforts that were made to bring in the language of climate justice, the strengthened references to equity, and that's not just international equity, it's also within communities equity, the meaningful participation. We have gender equality now in this report, and we have references to Indigenous peoples and local communities' land use and land use rights, which is critical, especially in mitigation issues. So I will end with that, with with the call to say, while we're in an existential crisis, we are the need and that optimism to hold to a livable environment. And while our governments may not feel very revolutionary, we need us to be revolutionary and transform the root causes together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. I think also what you highlighted is the long road that we've been through over all these past years since the first IPCC report, and how much, in a way, there's an effort in this last IPCC work to speak of humans and environment in a very connected way, and to have the whole connection to the human and social dimensions of the whole climate action, and the science base has so much evolved, but the connection to the human and social dimension is striking, I think, in this all the new reports that have been now released by the IPCC. So we are at the end of our speakers panel, and we have, I think, we can have 10 minutes for questions. So I propose that we take maybe first we can take maybe 3 questions from the room to also say thank you to people who came in person to the Environment House here in Geneva, and then maybe we can take 3 questions online that have been posted by people who are online. So please be crisp in the questions, and the speakers in the responses. You can say who wants to respond, but do we have first questions here? Yes? So we have 2 questions. Please go ahead. I think you have to press, and yeah, thank you. And introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. My question is to Jim. My name is Marek. I work with the International Labour Organization as an economist. And I was surprised by the footnote that you said that GDP will be slightly, even if only slightly, but slightly negative impacted. And I think that has a huge implication because, as we have seen from the financial crisis up to the COVID pandemic recovery, governments are still interested very much in GDP growth. So even with a slight decrease, you will not gain those in the developing world. So we at the ILO, we use so-called structural simulation models as compared to general equilibrium models. And that may be the reason for the difference, and we're working, and including with International Monetary Fund, which find different results, as well as other leading research institutes such as Cambridge Econometrics. Let me just give you an example of the difference between the two. If you have a combustion engine car, you just keep running it. You believe that is an efficient way. So that is a general equilibrium model, which just keeps the structure of the economy going, believing it's at the perfect stage of efficiency. Now, a structural simulation model looks into an investment into an electric car, which doesn't exist yet. So the structural simulation model models the structure of an economy that is not really existing yet. And so what you find is that in an initial investment may be a little bit higher because electric cars new, charging points are not there, so forth. But however, in the long term, the return on the investment is much higher because you engage in a structural change, which is a normal process in economics. So I believe, although there's not an economic report, I do understand. However, there's an importance in looking at that question of GDP and employment creation, because the induced effects of workers in new industries, as in renewables, has a positive effect on GDP growth as well. So the question, Kim, Jim, to you is whether that was a political discussion, because we know that there are politics in the report, or whether that is based on just a simple review of papers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll take all questions, and then we'll turn to the speakers for the responses. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Janos Pastor from the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. I have a very brief remark and one question. The remark is that when I put all these things together, it actually doesn't look very good. Let's be honest to ourselves, which just makes the job even harder. But I think it's important to recognize that. But given that, and starting with Lindsay, who actually raised the question of justice, and I think that's really important. What I wanted to ask is, to what extent does this report address the question of going net negative? Because we talk a lot about net zero, but we know that at some point the world has to go to net negative. In fact, some people are talking from a justice angle that some countries should start that already now, to give more space to others to develop. So the question is there something specific that is addressed in this report about net negative, or is it just doing more of the same thing? Thank you.
Thank you. Very clear question. We have a third question here. Thank you.
Thank you, Thank you, Dina. My name, excuse me, my name is Atle Solberg. I work for the Platform on Disaster Displacement. It is more a remark, and maybe following up a little on you. If we are not optimistic, this doesn't look that good. And I think in the Department of Messaging, we shouldn't forget adaptation needs and the issue of loss and damage. And we do have some strong messages around the impact already felt. And that means we shouldn't only think about the marathon. We need to start running quite quickly on certain issues, and they are related to the humanitarian side and the immediate consequences we already see out there. So it's more a remark and a call for having discussion around mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and bring these two action areas together. We need to work on all fronts. So thank you, Dina.
Thank you so much, Atle. We have one more question here. I think there was, sorry, maybe, I think Kamal, you raised first, and then we go back to the online and back to you. I have to be fair with people who are online as well. So please, Kamal, yeah, and then we come back.
Thank you very much. Just it's actually a comment I want to make, and congratulations for the very powerful report. I think the report comes after COP26, where we've seen this commitment to phase down of unabated coal and inefficient and phase out of inefficient fossil fuels. But we all know the Glasgow Pact says to do that with a just transition. Now, there are different ways to understand what that means with a just transition. We at the International Labour Office are concerned that some may use this notion of a just transition as a sort of an excuse to slow down action and ambition. And that's why I felt that the way the IPCC report put in just transition as an enabler of higher ambition on mitigation, which is very much in line with the narrative we have in the world of work. I think this was very important, and it's very critical that we get the narrative right on just transition. What we mean is higher ambition on climate action, but together with the right social labor market policies that makes it sure that no one is left behind, but that we don't use it as an excuse for inaction. And this was very important to see in the IPCC report. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I propose that we go a bit back to the speakers so that they can respond and choose what the questions they want to respond to. Maybe, yes, Jim, you are online, and one question was directed to you.
Yeah, there was one specifically, and I have to say this is probably not...
We don't hear you very well.
Oh, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, better. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is not the place to discuss the difference between general equilibrium models and neo-Keynesian growth models. What I would simply point out is that these numbers did not take account of the economic benefits of avoided impacts. That's a point that we very much wanted to make. And indeed, we do talk about other ways of other indicators such as well-being that could supplement simple measures of GDP. On Janis Pastor's point about net negative, we do indeed talk about net negative. There is life beyond net zero, and I think there is information in there. And of course, it does rely on carbon dioxide removal if you are going to go below zero. Just one point I would make on the loss and damage point is about the overall messaging of the 3 working group reports. Inevitably, the working group 1 and 2 reports have dire messages, that they have communicated to the world. And what I think is distinctive about the working group 3 report, it's not about optimism versus pessimism. It's about fatalism versus human agency. And what we're trying to provide is the message that, human beings got us into this mess. We actually can make a difference and begin to at least start to address the situation we find ourselves in. Limited time, so I'll stop there.
It's wonderful. Fatalism versus human agency. I like that. Yes, Maria?
Well, I do think that, well, I like the comment on the net zero and beyond net zero, but we're quite far from there. We have seen a lot of controversy, about investment in nature, which have not helped. And I think what the business sector needs is a very clear guidance on where to invest and how to invest them, which might seem obvious, but I don't think it is. As I said when I presented, it is not an or, but it's an and. And I think if we want to get to the beyond net zero or the negative net zero, we need to start to think now about how to do it. So the comment by Janusz was very, very pertinent, while it is one that we obviously don't want to talk, because we would prefer we could decarbonize very fast. But that's also, we need to be realistic about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Maria. Lindsay, you wanted to respond to one of the questions? Or we take a new round?
No, you take a new question, please.
Okay. So I have quite a few questions that came through the online exchanges that are such diverse nature that we can try to raise a few of them. There's one question that's very technical from Mr. Christopher Chinapu, who was raising the question whether the committee had reviewed how carbon captured and storage can be used for new products, such as chemical aggregates. I think that's a very technical question. Maybe someone can respond to this. That would be great. I have another very interesting question of a totally different nature, much more about civil society and quite critical, from Mr. Richard Shears, who says that there is an inadequate representation of the bottom-up community engagement in the report, and that the dynamic civil society role could be better factored in the synthesis report. So that's very interesting also to see, maybe to have the insights from the co-chairs and colleagues involved in the report. There's another question that is interestingly connected to the discussion on labor and the question raised by our colleague from ILO and the discussion on small businesses. How to better include the small businesses in the next COP, and is this connected more with making labor central as a good model in this direction? And then I have maybe 2 other questions that you can pick up and decide to respond if you among the speakers. One question is from Ms. Nadine Bitar, highlighting that the report really focuses and mentions for the first time very, very strongly cities and the connection between cities and nature-based solutions, in particular in travel and urban transport. And she's wondering whether there are some urgent measures that you would highlight for cities right now. And the last question online from Ms. Elisabetta Abate is whether, according to the expertise of the speakers, how can countries enhance the ambition of their climate responses to support the goals of Paris Agreement? Very big and tough question, but very important one. And we had one more person in the room who wanted to maybe ask a question. So like this, we have 6 questions to pick up for our speakers. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. So my name is Rustam Aspana. I'm a physicist from CERN, so I'm kind of interested to learn about the process. And I appreciate the complexity of this report. In very long reports before having a look at this, it's quite a very complex document. So my comment or question is, I was wondering, what is the strategy for communication to the general public? Because looking at the report, it's very clear that the major changes lifestyles are necessary. But talking to people around me, I haven't met a person yet who is aware of type of changes that are required. Like, for example, an anecdote, I had tried to convince 10 friends to try vegetarianism, and it's a 0 success rate, right? I like my burger on Friday with a beer response, especially here in Geneva. So what I feel is that maybe what's lacking is communication, that stakeholder who is all the rest of the humanity who will be affected but not aware of this. Because when I look at the report as a physicist, I have a hard time reading it because it's very technical. For me, it was impossible actually almost to read it because it's experts. And I presume the same is also for the journalists, the same also for the activists online who have difficulty even understanding this report. So I feel maybe, and maybe that's what's coming with synthesis report, I'm not aware, but a communication that directed every single individual on Earth who is a stakeholder may be necessary to achieve the goals which this report presents. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Back to our panel. Who would like to start? Jim, I see you online, please.
Yeah. Let me just pick up two or three of these questions. First of all, the report does cover carbon capture and utilization as well as carbon capture and storage. It is covered in there, but just to flag that the technical potential for carbon capture and utilization is limited because there are only so many products into which the carbon can be embedded. On community engagement, I'm disappointed. I thought we'd actually done a little bit better on that because we've got chapters on policy, we've got chapters on demand side and consumers, and we have the wider sustainable development chapter, which I all think did address this area of community engagement, although there may not have been a chapter called community and engagement. And just finally, on this communication strategy, because it's quite important, and I don't think we expect the individual chapters to be picked up and read avidly by members of the public. They're not airport bookshop kind of material. What we do spend a lot of time thinking about is about derivative material that comes off the reports, whose primary audience is governments, to make them more communicable to wider audiences. And we do many outreach events where we try to put the messages in a plainer way. And we do have an enormous amount of engagement with the media. When the land report came out, I recall going on programs like the Radio Drive Time program in the UK, which is intended for people listening to things on their car radios on the way home from work, talking about diets and all of these issues. So we certainly have been able to try to get some of these issues over and explain them in a non-technical way to wider audiences. I'll stop there again, given time.
Thank you, Jim. Maria?
I'll take the one on the SME Climate Hub. So SMEs do not have the resources to go to COP. They don't even have the knowledge to understand what's going on at COP. But through the SME Climate Hub, we're going to make sure that they are present at COP through the digital means. Because let's face it, this is one of the wonderful things of our time, is that these companies have access to resources in their computer, in their workplace or at home, so that they can learn. So I think we just need to be very smart. And to the previous question about how do we communicate to SMEs and to civil society in a way that is actionable, and it is extremely easy for them to take action if we want to mobilize them. And unfortunately, the climate space is full of people really smart and with very complicated models and thinking. And sometimes, I think we have failed to bring the more simple messages to the general public. So let's work on this because we need everybody to come along, and I'm very happy to collaborate with many of you in doing that. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Lindsay?
I wanted to thank the person who talked about Working Group 2 and Working Group 3, because the synthesis report hopefully will integrate more. And I think Working Group 3 really brought in more than certainly we saw in the 5th assessment report, but obviously bringing those messages together for adaptation and mitigation, how we do our policy and integrate it, and people are involved and people benefit is critical. So those messages for the synthesis report can come out, but how do we communicate? Because the IPCC is very small and it needs us. It needs us to communicate and it needs us to live. And I think to live those examples. But as one climate negotiator said to me, if people aren't marching on the streets, our governments, my minister will not act as urgently as he or she needs. And I think our governments need to believe and to see us and to integrate and to make us part of it, because otherwise, if we don't see the benefit, people are going to step back and have their burgers and their beer on Friday. So it's both communication, it's information, and it's taking responsibility and accountability, our governments for what they could do and can do, and also for us to be engaged and to push them for that. Thank you.
That's very proactive. Thank you, Lindsay. I think we are coming to the end of this session. To conclude out, we have one more question, and then what I will do is just ask our speakers to give us in 30 seconds one key message to take away. But we have one more question, so can we take it, Diana, for yeah, we have time? Or do you have a very quick question? And then it can be summarized also in the key messages. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you for your patience. My name is Yanis and I'm a student of political science for an exchange semester here in Geneva. And my question relates to the input by Maria relating to the sustainable fuels actually, which should also be implemented within the next years and decades, and leading to the way of leaving the fossil fuels. And it relates to the challenge which arises for the infrastructure of the transport systems, also when it comes to hydrogen, for example, and the least developed or less developed countries, which may also be confronted to the issue of airports, which are also even in the European Union. And then I suppose that it's an even bigger problem, for example, on the African continent, to implement the infrastructure with new fuels and then incentivizing the aviation industry, for example, to also implement these technologies, because if the infrastructure doesn't exist, then I think that long-haul flights will not be used with these new fuels. Contemporarily, of course, it's not a matter of discussion because of the technological challenge to use them for long haul. So just on a long perspective, I guess, will there be multilateral treaties in order to implement these infrastructures, or how will it be confronted?
Thank you very much. So I suggest that Maria goes first and responds to this question, that it's addressed to her, and then these 30 or even less or key message you want us to take away also. So we'll go Maria, maybe then Lindsay, Jim, and then back to Sebastian.
So Women Business is part of an initiative. It's called Mission Possible Partnership, that is proving that it is mission possible to reduce emissions in the most hard-to-abate sector, which includes aviation. So I invite you to look at the roadmap there and see the different options that exist, which are very complicated for the aviation industry. So my key message is that, 1.5 is mission possible, but it's a mission. And it is a mission that we need to accelerate and requires scientists, governments, business, civil society to be quite aligned in going faster. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Lindsay?
Urgent, healthy, and fair transformations. This is the historic time for us to act. We cannot leave our children with an unhealthy environment, with reliance on climate engineering, on geoengineering. We can do it now, but we all have to be part of this, and we have to protect human rights and Indigenous people's rights in that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jim?
Yeah, I'll just be very quick. I'll just pick out one line that in the press release that actually caught a lot of attention globally, which was the now or never quote. It's now or never if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, and whatever level of ambition we have, it is very important that action is taken now. Otherwise, we will be closing down our options.
Thank you. And Sebastian?
Thank you. It's very hard to just come in after Jim with this a very important message at the end. But from a government perspective, it's about the IPCC that is policy relevant and not policy prescriptive. In that sense, the IPCC has given us a menu of options that are doable in terms of their potential and their costs. And I think that's very valuable. We have an optimistic situation where I can take this list of options to my minister and say, well, this is what we can do about taking action. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that we are to the close of this session. I want, first of all, to really thank the Geneva Environment Network and Diana, who please should be seen also on screen because she works behind screens and does amazing action here. So thank you so much, Diana. And thank you to absolutely everyone online and in presence. We encourage really people to come as much as possible to the events in person, but we are so happy that this new way of working also allows people from far away to be part of the discussions. So with this, I think we close the session today. There is something here that in theory closes session. It's so tempting, but I will refrain myself from hitting it. I will do privately after. Just so thank you so much to everyone and have a good rest of the day. Bye.